Welcome back. In this particular video, we're going to talk about stress, distress, and illness. Specifically, we'll talk about Module 10.1, which deals with health psychology and aspects of stress. In the next video, we'll talk about ways to cope with stress. Well, there is a reciprocal relationship between mind and body. In other words, what you think, how you think, and what you feel may influence your physiology, your body, your hormonal changes, and things like that. And what you do with your body also similarly influences how you think, how you feel. So, this reciprocal relationship is what health psychologists study the relationship between mind and body. And when we say mind and body, we are referring to the psychological and physical aspect of health. And health psychologists work at varied different kinds of places, like they work at universities, hospitals, government organizations. They are also researchers and health promoters. The main idea or the main objective of health psychologists, either if they're working at universities or hospitals or any of these places, is basically to promote health and to prevent disease. But disease is lack of health or lack of good health. Well, are you stressed? Raise your hand if you are. Well, I see that you raise your hand. Students in general, and especially at this time of the year, say that they feel stressed. In this video, we're going to talk about what stress is and how that influences our physical health and how we can change our perspectives on stress. So in this module 10.1, we'll talk about stress, what it is, and what it does to our body. Stress is not a negative thing as we imagine it to be. Stress is a normal everyday event. If you think of things that you're supposed to do and your ability to do those things, if they are balanced, right, then it's a good health, good stress. If it's imbalanced, in other words, you're unable to meet your daily demands, then you are having a bad stress. And then you try to understand that we are defining stress here as the demand that's placed on us. And the consequence of which is whether or not you're able to meet the demands that will determine if it's a good or bad stress and what effect it may have on your mental and physical health. Now, just to reiterate, we have defined stress as the demand that's placed on us so we can adapt to the environment. It's the demand placed on organism to adapt to its environment. Basically, it's a requirement to survive in the environment. Now, we've defined good stress as a manageable demand and bad stress as unmanageable. And when there's unmanageable demand, that's bad stress, that unmanageable stress, unmanageable demand leads to a feeling, and that feeling is distress. So you can see the difference here. Stress is a natural demand. Depending on whether or not you are managing it, changes it from being good to bad stress. And bad stress can actually take you a state, feeling called distress. What is distress? It is an internal state of physical or and mental pain or suffering. So when you ask people, are you stressed? And if they say that they are stressed, what they basically are referring to is that it's bad stress, or that the demand that's placed on them is actually having or influencing their physical state or mental state. So they're specifically referring to distress, not actual stress. So distress is the internal state of physical or mental suffering or pain. Now, this particular chart here beautifully describes the relationship between the demand placed on us and our ability to deal with it. And on the left side, we characterized it as good stress. On the right side, less the demand, more the demand, manageable the demand, imaginable, non-manageable the demand. So that's what the good and bad part comes. Now, just imagine if your demand is there isn't much demand and your ability is also okay in terms of managing it, you feel rushed out, right? Or you have this boredom, or you're under-involved, these kind of feelings. Once there is an increase in the ability with the increase in the demands placed on you, you're in this positive zone where you feel stimulated, you're alert, you're decisive, you're creative, you're effective, to a point where there is optimal level performance, both physical and mental. In other words, demands placed on you are just above threshold for you to actually be able to do it and feel good about yourself. That's the optimum level. The demands are not only just manageable, beyond little manageable, but you're actually taking care of those. So you always feel good about it. But what happens if your ability stays there, but the demands keep on increasing? Well, that leads to all negative feelings, reduced efficiency in your work, reduced alertness, you're overloaded, you're difficulty concentrating, you become indecisive, you become irritable, anxious, confused, fatigued, completely exhausted and burnt out. So you see, stress is a natural thing. A demand placed on us, and our ability is what it will determine whether or not you can actually cope with it. And always going for a demand that's a little higher than your ability is what will always keep you at this optimal zone. So, one last time. So, stress is a demand placed on us. Good if it's manageable. The stress is bad if it's not manageable. And unmanageable stress or demand will lead to a painful mental or physical state. And that's what distress is. So, what are the symptoms of stress then? Well, stress is different, both physical and psychological symptoms. And again, when we say stress, we are talking about unmanageable stress, in other words, bad stress. Now, the symptoms are not necessary in the sense that some people actually feel stress, yet they don't have any physical manifestation. Reported that they feel dizzy, um, and few also report that there is a change in sex drive, and few also report that their teeth grinding. But most of the times, or most of the individuals who experience stress, they actually talk about these symptoms at the top. Fatigue, they're easily tired, they have headache, they have indigestion or upset stomach or muscular tension. These are the most common ones, or change in appetite. And the other ones are not so frequent. Again, these are potential symptoms, and different individuals react to stress differently in these terms. Now, coming to the psychological symptoms of bad stress, again, there are more frequent ones, and some people actually don't experience anything. Again, there's individual difference in what people experience, both physiologically and psychologically, or physically and psychologically. So, most commonly reported psychological symptom of stress is anger and irritability, followed by feeling sad, feeling nervous, and to the same extent, lack of interest or lack of motivation, lack of energy. Some also report feeling as though they could cry. Some may experience stress without any of these symptoms. Again, it varies from person to person, but these are the most commonly experienced symptoms, psychological symptoms, with the frequency presented here. Well, now that we have defined stress as the demand placed on us, now where do these demands come from? In other words, especially the bad stress. So we're going to call the sources of stress, and the source of stress is commonly referred to as stressors. So stressors are sources of stress. And these are commonly studied sources of stress. In other words, bad stress may come from any of these situations and may lead to distress if these are not managed appropriately. And so the commonly encountered or studied stressors include hassles, big life events, frustration, conflict, and trauma. And we can talk about each one of these things, starting with hassles. So hassles. Hassles are the common day-to-day irritating demands placed on us. You're gonna get to your job, but there's traffic jam. These little small annoyances can build up. And if you constantly experience these on a day-to-day basis, then that may lead to what is called as chronic stress, a state of continuing demand that's placed on us. And just imagine if you have a daily experience of hassles on a continuous basis that would be referred to as chronic stress. Chronic stress may also come from such more serious situations like financial situation, job situation, or marital problems or conflicts, or some chronic medical condition one may be going through. Chronic stress is when you experience a stress on a continuous basis. In other words, when you are placed under on demand, and asked, expected to do something on a continuous basis and you can't manage it. Chronic stress over long run eventually leads to a state where you completely feel exhausted, irritable, and depressed. So, what can you do? What's the antidote to these everyday demands placed on us, the hassles that, if built up, may lead to a chronic stress? Well, a simple antidote is daily uplifts, minor positive experience of everyday life, just like smiling or giving a genuine compliment to someone. or just doing something that you really like. Daily uploads would really make a big difference, because then these day-to-day hassles are not piling up. So can you pause here for a second and maybe call your mom or call somebody and give them a genuine compliment? I'll pause here. Okay, I hope you liked it. You feel better now. So the second stressor, the first one was hassles. The second one is a big life event. The big life event can be either a positive thing or a negative thing. It all depends on the demands the events are placing on you. So marriage can be a positive thing or a negative thing, or having a child can be a positive or negative, depending on whether you're ready for that or not. So a change in job could either be positive or negative, depending on how you are treated, and that all may lead to stressful situation. Again, is it something you're expecting? Are you ready to manage or not? If you're not ready to manage, any change, either positive or negative, may lead to some demands, stress, and if it's not manageable, it becomes bad stress. If it's not taken care of, then it leads to distress. So the third stress we're going to talk about is the frustration. Well, frustration is the negative emotional state, and you experience it when your efforts to pursue a goal are blocked. For example, you're trying to submit your final paper and the computer crashes on you, right? Or the Word document doesn't save the information that you've been trying to save. So these things, these frustrations, um, these negative emotions when you're trying to achieve a goal and if this goal is blocked, these frustrations are those negative emotions that you experience at that point. That can lead to a bad stress, right? Again, time is essence here, and whether or not you have your materials already put together. You know what you can do at this point? Well, I don't know if you're paying attention to the emails, but around this time, typically most of the universities send this particular notification. Well, it says, we know finals can be stressful. Don't let computer problems get in the way of your academic success. Get your computer, tablet, or smartphone tuned up and running smoothly before finals begin, all for free. Did you receive that? It's called the tune up your tech. Well, this is to prevent the frustration, which could be really stressful in a bad way. So coming to the fourth stressor, conflict. Well, people who are in conflict, they shift between competing goals. They don't know if they're going to do this, they don't know if they're going to do that. So it's a state of tension. Conflict is a state of tension resulting from or because of two or more competing goals that demand a resolution. And most of the times it becomes so indecisive that you wait and take the default option. So that's what conflict is. It's a state of tension because of two or more competing goals. So conflict occurs when two or more incompatible behaviors or motivations compete for expression. And there are three types of conflicts here, and we're going to talk about each one of those. The first one is called the approach conflict. So you're here, the person, there is one goal here, another goal here, and you're motivated to that towards this. The choice is between two attractive goals. So that's what it's called approach conflict. This is the easiest of all the conflicts to deal with. It's like whether I should watch season 2 Game of Thrones or should I watch, I don't know, Breaking Bad. So the choice is between, hopefully, if you like both those series. So the choice is between two good things and attractive goals, and it's easy to manage. The second kind of conflict is the avoidance conflict, where you're not motivated to pursue any of these negative goals. The choice is between two attractive goals. So you're trying to avoid both, right? So the conflict is between two. So that's what's called avoidance. And it is more difficult than the approach one. And the third conflict is the approach avoidance conflict, where the goal is one, and you as a person have mixed feelings towards it, in the sense that there are positives to doing it, you're motivated, there are negatives to doing it. In other words, you're not motivated. So the choice is whether to or not to pursue the goal that has both positive and negative aspects to it. So is the traumatic stressors. Traumatic stressors are those negative traumatic events that one might have experienced, and which leads to later psychological disorders. One best example is if you have a negative um, traumatic experience, like we all remember this particular day where we were and this haunts some of us even till today. So this experience, this trigger of these stressful situation after our traumatic experience is called PTSD. PTSD here stands for post-traumatic, after a trauma, stress disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder triggers and it's better to see a therapist to get help for PTSD. Is the type A behavior. Now, type A and type 2 behaviors are the commonly classified categories of behavioral patterns. Type A behavior pattern individuals are those that are impatient. They always time urgent and they are very competitive and hostile and they always rush through things. This is type A personality. They try to get the most in the shortest possible time. This personality kind can influence the demand that's placed on them and may eventually become chronic stress and leads to both physical and psychological symptoms. So you see the difference in patterns of behavior here. This is type A, this type B. This is stressful. So far we looked at define stress and we tried to differentiate stress from distress. And we also talked about the sources of stress, the stressors. It's time to understand stress in a different fashion. At any level, basically, you can think about an individual level or a couple level or at the family level or a society level. We tend to collect resources and build resources and protect resources. Like, what do you do when you wake up in the morning? You get ready, you eat some food. By afternoon, you eat food again. By dinner time, you eat food again. Look, if you think about metabolic activities, there's a lot going on in your cells, and your system is trying to restore, build, collect, and protect these resources. Think about in that sense, then stress occurs. Resource when there is a demand, then you need to use your resources to meet the demand. Correct. And again, you can talk about it at any level, but we are specifically pertaining to our discussion to the individual level. So whenever there is a threat to the resource, right, a threat of a resource loss, that's when you experience stress. The threat can be a real threat or a subjective threat. Maybe there is no real threat to the resource, but you feel like there is. Or there's a real threat. It doesn't matter as long as you're experiencing the threat to your resource. What happens after we experience that threat or when we experience the threat? Well, each time we experience stress, we all have a common pattern of response to stress. And these common patterns are both physiological common patterns and psychological common patterns. And if these physiological and psychological common patterns, if these are inappropriate to meet the demand, the stress that's placed on us, well, that leads to some systemic changes. It leads to some very specific changes in our entire system. We're talking about circulatory system, endocrine system, we're talking about digestive system, we're talking about all biological systems. And these systemic changes, because of continued unmet, inappropriate responses, lead to these changes, and these changes are commonly referred to as gas. Again, when there is stress, especially bad stress, we respond in a certain way. There's a pattern, and these patterns over and over again, if they prove to be inappropriate to meet the demands, then that leads the system, our entire system, go through some specific changes. These systemic changes that you experience are often referred to as GAS, the General Adaptation Syndrome. I know the name GAS is bad here, but just as an acronym, General Adaptation Syndrome. So one person who extensively did research on this topic of GAS, the Generalized Adaptation Syndrome, is Dr. Hans Sale, I guess. So Hans is sometimes referred to as the stress doctor. Not that he puts people or patients under stress, but he studied extensively stress. Now, the Generalized Adaptation Syndrome is specifically about the physiological responses to stress. So he studied a lot on the physiological responses to stress. So these are general responses. That's what is a Generalized Adaptation Syndrome of the body to any demand that's placed on us for change, and especially when the demand is not met. So we're talking about bad stress, distress, and how that eventually in the long run leads to physiological responses. So GAS refers to then these physiological responses that occur when an organism fails to respond appropriately to threats. The threats can be physical threat or emotional threat, and the threat continues. And this general adaptation syndrome has three stages to it. Again, this specifically refers to a situation where continuously the demands that are placed on you are unmet and leading you to feel distress over a long period of time. So your system goes through three stages each time you experience it over and over again. General alarm stage, resistance stage, and exhaustion stage, and we're going to talk about each one of these stages. So the first stage is the alarm stage. So during this alarm stage, this is like the first physiological response to the stressor, bad stress, when especially it's not met. These responses are like the fight or flight responses. These are the responses that your body immediately produces to deal with the threat. Like you see a tiger, your heart pounds, your body reacts, everything is good to go. That's the alarm stage. Right? In this particular alarm stage, which is the stage that you experience when you experience distress or a bad stress, your system is completely strongly aroused, a strong arousal stage where both psychologically and physiologically your body is at a higher rate in terms of its alertness and in terms of its activities, like utilizing resources to just make sure that you survive this stage. Well, what triggers this alarm stage? Well, when there is a threat to your resources, if you go back to that analogy of individual resources, when there is a threat, either there is a physical threat, where you see a tiger, or there's a psychological stress like you have an exam or a paper submission or a project that's due. So this is what triggers the alarm stage. Then why is this stage? Well, if you can imagine, it has evolutionary importance, right? It is for the survival of the species. When you see a tiger, your system should be ready to run and survive, right? So this kind of prepares you to survive. So it's important. So the phobias people experience, like for instance, social phobia, people are scared and your body reacts differently when they're in a social circumstances. Some researchers think that evolutionary psychologists and in general people think one way, one explanation, one understanding of phobias is that these are remnants of our instincts. So you're in an alarm stage, which is a natural thing. It's just that those phobias that alarm stage is not required for these social settings, but in some of us, it stays, and that's what leads to social phobia. And some of us have more than others on these phobias or these alarm stages. Well, what happens next? Well, alarm stage is momentary. Moment is momentary. In other words, it's going to go away. Your system cannot be continuously aroused and in alarm stage for extended period of time, right? It's momentary. It's only for time being. And if you survive, right, the person returns to normal stage. Well, there are possibilities that the individual does not survive. So let's assume one survives the alarm stage. In other words, the stressor, there is stress, you see a tiger, and your alarm stage help you run away from the situation. So your behavior of running away helped you. So that's fine then. What if it doesn't? In other words, there is a continued stressor. Well, your response to the system or your bodily response did not help you survive. The stressor is still there, and you still survive, but the stressor is there. What happens then? Well, the system cannot be active for a long time. Remember the alarm stage? Your system is completely aroused. You're psychologically, physiologically, you're alert, but it can't be alert all the time, right? The system adapts to the stressor. Hence the name, the adaptation stage or the resistance stage. So, how does it adapt then? Well, the system adapts to the continuing stressor by returning to the baseline. The baseline here is both psychological and physiological, but we're more interested in this one, physiological, right? So the system tries to restore the energy, repair the exhausted cells. Keep in mind that the system is still aroused because the stressor is still there. Of course, it is not aroused as it was in the alarm stage because you don't have enough resources to be continuously active, aroused. So that leads to such psychological symptoms like anger, fatigue, you're tired, you're irritable. Well, what if the stressor still persists? That brings you on to the final stage, the stage of exhaustion. So with continuous energy distortion, where your body is highly aroused and is also trying to restore the energy because the stress is persistent, then energy is lost. That's why it's called the exhaustion stage, right? And if you're continuously in this state where you have a paper you need to submit, you thought you would do it by tomorrow, it's not. You're continuing that. Again, you ask for extension. Again, you're unable to do it. So if the stress is continual, then over time this leads to, if that's like a pattern one is going through, then eventually that will lead to some very general changes in the system, right? Because of continued adaptation stage. Some systemic disorders, like your body's trying to adjust, right? So there'll be systemic diseases related to kidneys, heart, whatnot. And psychologically, individual may experience depression. And this particular graph shows the different phases of stress on the x-axis and our resistance to stress on the y-axis, where the lower bottom is the low resistance and at the top is the high resistance. So as you can see, you're most resistant to stress during the resistance during phase 2, the adaptation stage. In stage 1, you are not building anything, but you're using resources, so you're less resistant to stress. But here you're building resources at the same time you're also experiencing it also, but at least you're building resources at this point, so you're highly resistant to stress. And here your system is completely exhausted. Your reserves are completely depleted. So here you are least resistant to stress. Just imagine if your body goes through this cycle over and over and over and over again, well, that leads to some general systemic changes in the body, which are related to the gas, as we discussed earlier, and leads to heart, kidney, and other diseases. Well, now let's look at what exactly happens physiologically in terms of endocrinal changes in the body when you experience stress. So we can talk about body's response to stress. Now, everything starts from hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is the structure that's a part of the limbic system, if you remember. It's below the thalamus, so it's called hypothalamus. Parts of hypothalamus and thalamus and amygdala and hippocampi, they together form a structure for emotional regulation that is the limbic system. Now, hypothalamus play a very important role for immediate emotional responses. So this is what actually your body goes through when you experience stress, like mostly the alarm stage that we are referring to here. So your hypothalamus, because it's a part of the limbic system, it initiates by, once it experiences a stressor, it kind of triggers a stress response. So stress response starts from hypothalamus. This hypothalamus actually activates pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is the master of endocrine glands. It controls other endocrine glands. So the pituitary gland here, it activates or it releases the hormone called ACT. A is adrenal, related to adrenal glands, right? C, cortical, so adrenocorticotrophic hormones. So basically, these hormones specifically act on cortical structure of the adrenal glands to release some other hormones. So that's why these are called ACTH, adrenocorticotrophic hormones. These adrenocorticotrophic hormones released by the pituitary gland, they reach the kidneys, and over the kidneys you have these adrenal glands. They eventually go to the adrenal glands and they stimulate the adrenal glands to release these hormones. These are the stress hormones, the cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. These are the hormones that are directly related to the physiological changes we experience, like heart rate, respiratory rate, perspiration. It's because of these hormones, which are important because this is the alarm stage. So when we talk about stress response, the cortisol and epinephrine, norepinephrine responses of our body, then we're talking about alarm stage, right? And this is a stage which is called as commonly referred to as the fight or flight stage. You either fight or you fly, depending on how you evaluate the situation. But this is not the only response. There are other stress responses that are released, and these are the then different responses. I'm gonna post this video. Well, what we do, in other words, our behavioral response to stress is very important. You can respond in a way that helps you, or you may respond in a way that actually hurts you. It all depends on the situation and how you're dealing. The question is, how can we respond to stress well in a way that it least affects our body and health, at least physiologically? Well, we call this coping. Coping is a mechanism. It's referred to either take over, reduce, or build resistance to tolerate the stress, especially the bad stress. So, what kind of things you do when you're stressed is very important. That determines the body changes, the physiological changes, the systemic changes that your body may go through. People cope with stress in many ways. Some ways are good ways. In other words, these are ways where your system is actually not going through this negative general systemic changes. While other ways are maladaptive, where in the sense that eventually the goal is not met or you have not coped well with the situation. So your system is going through those specific general systemic changes. So examples of maladaptive stage are like striking out at others, giving up last minute, I'm not going to do this, okay, or being defensive, or indulging oneself, or blaming oneself, or blaming others for situations. These things are different kinds of maladaptive coping mechanisms, and the adaptive ones are the better ones. So, what is a better way to deal with cope is, well, first of all, you have to reduce the effect of stress on our body. So, moderating the effect of stress is at most important when you are stressful. So, few things you can do. These are like psychological buffers. Again, you're going through the stage, but at least these things will buffer the effect on your body. Social support. Talk to your friends, talk to your parents, talk to your friends. Now, believe in yourself, self-efficacy. Believe that you can do it. It doesn't matter the actual performance. It's just that you can do it. Having that thinking that if you prepare well ahead of time, you'll definitely do it well. But even then, some feel that they can't do it. That's why they feel stressed. So just thinking and being more self-efficient would definitely help. Sometimes predictability and controllability helps. In other words, if I want to give a presentation somewhere, I feel more comfortable if I go to that place beforehand and kind of see what kind of equipment they have, what kind of room it is. That kind of builds in this expectation, this idea that I know what's going to happen. I know what to expect. This expectation, this predicting things, controlling things really helps in some circumstances, and it helps some people more than others. And there is this internal feeling. This locus is called internal versus external locus of control. If you think the situation is in your hand versus not in your hand, is another way of looking at it. Where if you think that things are not in your hand, you're going to feel more stress. If not in your hand, external locus. Versus if you think that things are in my hand, I'm going to do better. It's a different kind of looking at the same thing. So having an internal locus of control will actually give you more control and predictability to the situation, and you deal with the situation better. And general attitude also helps. Like if you work on becoming psychologically hardy, you say psychological hardiness will really help, like being committed to whatever goal you're taking up. And when you're challenged, be open to the challenge. And you believe in yourself, and you think that what you do will determine rather than the actual situation itself. Again, this is kind of related to the idea, if you remember from the very first day we talked about having a learning goal as opposed to a performance goal. Then you can be open to challenge because you are here to learn as opposed to perform well. If you learn, then you'll definitely perform well. But thinking about performing well will definitely not help you either learn or perform well. And the other thing is the optimism. If you're more optimistic, then definitely you'll see things in a positive note, and you can better deal with the situation.